Hello, listeners and viewers, and welcome to the Rethinking Education podcast, Education's Critical Friend. My name is Dr. James Mannion.
And I'm the real David Cameron, and I welcome you too.
The real McCoy. Yes, welcome indeed. And welcome to this really exciting episode, I think, where we're going to be speaking with two very outspoken guests about different aspects of the schools bill currently going through Parliament, the Children's Schools and Wellbeing Bill, and also related topics. And I think it's going to be a very meaty conversation with Warwick Mansell and Naomi Fisher. But before we get into all of that, let's have our customary how do you do, David? How do you do?
How do you do, James? I'm good.
How do you do? It's got quite a gentlemanly vibe this week.
Yeah.
So, what's been going on north of the border? What's been going on with you?
Well, not so much north of the border, but north of the wall. I was at the Next Decade event on the 25th of May, and the most remarkable experience. Nearly 1,200 people there. It had a real grassroots vibe to it, a real feel like a kind of Northern Rocks event, that type of thing. People were really buzzing, but it was backed by the Wellspring Academy Trust. And that meant it had a level of professionalism that went beyond anything that I'd experienced previously.
Mm.
Leeds Armory, it was it was pretty much like Glastonbury. They had 5 stages. I was in the NME stage, obviously. Uh, hadn't quite made it. Emerging talent category. Um, but I never made the pyramid. They only had one act on the pyramid stage, and that was Matthew Syed, who was very good, very thought-provoking.
Mm.
And then the the stages that they had covered research, they covered um, positive regard practice, trauma-informed practice. I was actually on the level playing field stage where the ranters were exiled. I was kind of carrying on a long Luddite tradition there. Um, but there was a absolutely terrific buzz on the day, and it lasted throughout the day. I was covering the last session. Um, I had a room full, which was amazing because they could have been going to see Dave Whitaker. They could have been going to see Hal Roberts or Lee Majors Elliott or Vic Goddard. It was all superstars, apart from me, and I still had a full room. And it left me on a real high. Um, I'm just so aware, James, that what you're trying to do with other colleagues to get this education policy alliance off the ground
Yeah.
really finds echoes in that whole Next Decade thing because they don't want that to be a one-off. They compiled a manifesto on the basis of the day that they'll be sending off to Bridget Phillipson, and hopefully she'll still be there when it arrives. But they're sending off their manifesto compiled from the voices of the audience. And I think it's very much in line with the unconference idea that we've been talking about for some time. So that was a real highlight for me.
Amazing. Can you explain a bit more about the event? So it was called the Next Decade. What was the theme of it? What were they trying to achieve with it?
Well, the idea, I think, was really to look forward to the next decade and say, where are we getting it wrong? And also, to be fair, what have we got to build on? And then where do we need to go now? And they were trying to capitalize on the time of change, new government, new education team within government, keen to take advantage of that and get in early with some clarity from the profession and beyond. I mean, it was lots and lots of teachers and school leaders there, but quite a mixed audience in lots of ways. Um, and they really wanted to get this idea of what's the way forward. Lots of effort to think more about equality, lots of effort to think about how we haven't been successful at national level in changing outcomes for young people significantly.
Yeah.
I talked a lot about the themes that we explored in that Four Nations podcast we did about how England was characterized by this narrow certainty and had real success in terms of attainment. I think really significant signs of improvement in England. But whether or not it's the kind of improvement that meets the challenges that we are facing,
Right.
both as a society and as part of an international community, much, much more questionable. And a real willingness to look at that.
Interesting. That links nicely into. So I recently wrote a blog. It came out just the weekend just gone, and I called it "Confronting the Educational Polycrisis." And like the word polycrisis has sort of been doing the rounds a bit in recent years. I don't know if you've come across that word much. It's
No,
it was a word that was invented in the 1990s by a complexity theorist called Edgar Morin, and it's essentially poly meaning many, right? It's essentially just a word used to describe a situation where multiple crises converge and interact and sort of become entangled and mutually reinforcing sometimes, and therefore very difficult to resolve. And when people talk about the polycrisis, they often talk about like a global phenomenon that's about the interplay between, say, the war in Ukraine and cost of living and climate crisis and economic disruptions and what have you. And so and I was thinking like we can apply this term, I think, to just within education. If you just zoom in within education, I think that this phrase of like an educational polycrisis is apt. And if you think of and in this piece, I identified 7 crises, and I could have listed 10 more at least. The attendance crisis, people often talk about, 2 million persistent absentees, more than 20% of the school population, which is just crazy. 170,000 of whom are severely absent, missing more than half of their time in school. The mental health crisis, the NHS now estimates that 1 in 5 children and young people aged 8 to 25 have a probable mental health disorder, up from 1 in 9 before the pandemic. So that's almost doubled in the space of about 5 years. The behavior crisis, right? Like lots of people talking about the impact on teacher well-being of just like dealing with very challenging behavior in schools. And the most recent DFE National Behavior Survey, 76% of teachers said that misbehavior is disrupting many of their lessons, and so on and so on. And we know the stats around huge increases in suspensions are up by double in the last 5 years. Exclusions up by almost a third just in the last year alone, right? Misogyny and sexual abuse, the stuff that we were talking about with Lewis Wedlock, and others, that was recently brought to attention through that Netflix drama Adolescence. There was a recent BBC poll about the endemic extent of misogyny in our schools, teacher recruitment, teacher retention, and educational inequity, right? The level playing field thing. And I could have, there's we could talk about the crumbling school estate, we could talk about funding, we could talk about any number of things, but there is, I think, a polycrisis. And I think, and it's interesting because crisis, people sometimes talk about crisis in quite an acute sense. It's like, there's like a humanitarian crisis because there's been an earthquake and something sort of sudden has been disruptive and there's a crisis to deal with. But crisis can also be like slow and creeping. And it's just a situation that sort of gradually gets worse until it gets to a point of going, okay, we're now at crisis point. And I think that you could argue that we're at that point in each of these things. And you can see how interconnected all of those problems are. How can we fix teacher retention and recruitment without addressing behavior? Without, how is attendance feed into that? And what's the end of the piece of string here? But and then in this piece, I sort of outline 15 sort of like principles as to like how we could perhaps get on a level on an even footing and just agree to approach this. First of all, to acknowledge that there is a polycrisis, that this is not a business as usual situation. Like lots of people are suffering because of the way that the system is currently configured and it's creaking at the seams in lots of ways. And we need to acknowledge that. We need to face it together, and we need a united front in bringing together people from all different walks of life, young people, teachers, parents, politicians, to sit together around the table. We're not going to expect this to be fixed by some, Mandarin in Whitehall. This is something that everybody needs to be involved in. But I think the first step is to acknowledge that we are in a state of crisis.
Yeah, I was stunning there for a for a moment. I thought I'd become caught up in an episode of More or Less. If you ever listen to that, a blinding display of statistics there, all rolled completely off the tongue without reference to notes, James. So, hats off to you on that one. But you're absolutely right, and I think part of the problem is that you're now dealing with the same situation we've dealt with in Scotland for years, where government has been so invested in their claims for success in terms of the reforms that they've made in education that they will not recognise the clear signs that the system simply is not working. And the attendance issue is massive. You know, we're not only getting absence, but we're getting partial attendance, we're getting selective attendance, we're getting all sorts of difficulties. And that's so disruptive in terms of continuity in provision. Because what do you do if you've got kids who aren't there one day, they're back the next? What do? Do you catch them up? Do you work with the kids that were there the day before? There's all of that going on. And you're absolutely right. We need to name it. I used one of James Baldwin's quotes in the presentation I did at the Next Decade, which is not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it's faced.
Right.
And I think that's exactly the point you're getting across, that if we cannot face up to the fact that there are some really devastating issues that require to be tackled,
Yeah.
then we are going to create a genuine crisis which may be difficult to get out of.
Yeah, I agree, and I don't think enough people. I don't think it is being faced up to within the people who are sort of who commentate on and sort of act in education. So much of the activity is based around sort of like sharing of good practice and like tweaks, essentially. It's like, here's how to start a lesson, here's how to give feedback, here's how to, just like codifying the process of teaching and sort of breaking it down into bite-sized pieces that are sort of easily digestible. And I think that, it's good that that work is happening. I'm not denigrating that work, but it's like we need more than tweaks here. Like this system is very clearly not working, and it's like been built with good intentions. Like nobody's. One of the things I write in this list of sort of like guiding principles is like recognize that the educational polycrisis is not the fault of any single organization or actor. Blame or shame will get us nowhere. We're trying to do something really difficult here, and there's also much to conserve, right? We're not saying that we need to tear the system up and start again, but we do need to create forums, I think, is the first place where we just start having a conversation, an ongoing series of conversations that involve a wide range of people about how we're going to figure out how to untangle and unpick this.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, as you already pointed out, the two guests we've got today are very much part of that. Part of that wider conversation. And I think, again, as you've indicated, two of the more challenging voices uh, in that conversation. But, James, I am not letting you away with this level of self-indulgence, because I know it's not just education you've been doing some other really important stuff over the last couple of weeks. So tell us quickly about that.
Right. Yes. Thank you for the little setup for a plugin. So there's two really interesting things that have been happening for me. One is that like there's quite an unexpected thing which is that off the back of hi Warwick, we're just wrapping up the introduction here. We'll be with you in a second.
Okay.
Is that off the back of the Making Change Stick book that I published earlier this year, which is really just about school improvement. It's just about how to implement change effectively in schools. But some people have picked up on it as a playbook for how we can bring about this sort of wider systemic change that we've just been talking about. And there's been this sort of a think tank, if you like, has been created. It's called RCE Making Change Stick. It's sort of named after the book, and the RCE stands for Rights Centric Education. And it was initiated by an educator based in Canada called Richard Fransham, but it involves lots and lots of people, and in particular the work of Don Berg, who's a writer in the US who's written a book called The Agentic Schools Manifesto, which is essentially about taking some of the ideas that Naomi speaks a lot about, actually, who we'll be speaking to shortly, about self-determination theory and how, like, in order to have well-being, people need autonomy and relatedness as well as competence in sort of knowledge and skills and so on. And schools have put most of our eggs into that basket of competence and trying to build mastery and knowledge and awareness and what have you, and has just really overlooked these other two very important aspects of human well-being. And Don has written a really interesting book about that, and he's very involved in this. And so if people want to get involved in this, it's an open forum. We're having these conversations on Tuesday evenings. We've done two so far, and the recordings are available. I'll put links in the show notes, and there's 3 more coming up. The next one starting next Tuesday, which Don is going to lead on. And there's another organization called World Systems Solutions, who are thinking about what's happening in the world beyond schooling as well, and how we can sort of join up our thinking. So it's very interesting. There's about 150 people who have signed up to this thing so far from all over the world. And so that's super interesting.
Yep. And Warwick has joined us, so we're going to miss the opportunity to hear about your also stellar rise as a music superstar, but we'll save that for a future edition. And let's move on to today's podcast.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Warwick Mansell, welcome back to the Rethinking Education podcast.
Thanks very much. It's good to be here again.
Yeah, you're in hallowed company. I don't have too many return guests, or we don't have too many return guests. So you're very welcome. And in a bit of a breach with tradition, I'm going to ask David to introduce today's guest.
All right. Well, I'm absolutely delighted to do that because you've introduced Warwick before, and I'm probably just going to repeat lots of the stuff that you said when you did that. Warwick Mansell is actually living my alternative life. I would really quite like to be him when I grow up. So he's a campaigning educational journalist and has been since '97. He's investigated, written about all aspects of school reform. His areas of specialism have ranged from the accountability system to the implications of the academy policy in England. He's also managed to write a book, another depressing thing that I'm intensely envious of, contribute to another. He's penned articles for all sorts of publications. He's won or been nominated for an absolute shed load of awards, regularly features as a conference speaker and panelist. And on top of all of that, he owns and runs Education Uncovered, which does, in my view, a fantastic job in fulfilling its mission to shine a light on educational reform in England. If I didn't know better, James, I would assume that you'd only invited him here simply to aggravate my imposter syndrome. But on that basis, welcome.
Thank you very much. How do I follow that introduction? That's very kind of you. Thank you.
Well, yes, and indeed, there was a bit of that. You've spotted my ruse, David. So the reason that this conversation came about is that Warwick was invited to review the book Unfinished Business, the book about the life and legacy of Sir Tim Brighouse that David helped to edit and will not stop banging on about. With absolutely good intentions, and I feel like we're doing the Unfinished Business advert here. But Warwick, you had some reservations, didn't you, about that? And I think David, perhaps you could just frame that a little bit more of what happened in that interaction, and then we'll get into some of your concerns with that book, Warwick.
Yeah, well, Warwick did, and he actually managed to bring me up short. I'm not often out radicaled. So it was a real treat for me when I saw Warwick's comments. He was disappointed that we weren't sceptical or questioning enough about what he described as the biggest set of changes to the control of schools we've seen in at least the past 35 years. And it's the Academy's policy, which of course institutionally detaches schools from their local communities. And while we include voices that are pro-academy in the book, and Warwick rightly points out that Tim Brighouse himself had anxieties about the Academy's policy and the impact of it. And Tim's absolutely at the heart of that book, and these reservations weren't reflected anywhere in it. And I was, as I say, I was taken aback by that, because as soon as you said it, I recognised that it genuinely was an issue. So, Warwick, what should we have said, and what issues should we have been raising in the Unfinished Business book?
I mean, goodness, this is that's quite a question. I think, you know, I suppose my immediate thought was, I mean, firstly, I've got to say, I've huge, like everybody, had huge respect for Tim Brighouse, and you know, knew him a little bit. And so I guess when I picked up the book, I was just surprised that the Academy's policy hadn't featured, particularly because it, you know, it has been, it's probably fair to say, it's been sort of my obsession within education policy, with probably certainly in the last 10 years, just because I think it's had so many implications. And so I suppose that was just my overriding thought. You know, if you were going to feature, particularly because you've got somebody coming from the other side, which is particularly Leora Cruddas, who's obviously the Federation of School Trusts, which you know, speaks on behalf of the trust sector. You know, you were just surprised there wasn't sort of a more skeptical voices in there really asking questions about this, because I do, as I say, I think it's got there's huge questions, and just generally it's just is a massive overhaul of school structures, which, although, you know, your average person might not be very familiar with, your average parent perhaps, unless they come into contact with some of the problems of the system, you know, it is very, very significant, I think. Yeah,
and I think I absolutely agree with that. I think there are all sorts of issues that we should have picked up on, because Tim Brighouse achieved things within local authorities, both in Birmingham and in Oxford, where he was part of the local authority team. But in a sense, the London Challenge was really governmentally, local authority driven. And the idea of fragmentation within the system, I think, undermines that possibility of wholesale change. Is that a view that you share?
I mean, I would say, again, coming back to Tim himself, I think, you know, he obviously got things done. He was a visionary and did get things done, and worked with people from, you know, all parts of the education system, and you know, and so in that sense, you know, he wasn't someone who would go out and, you know, overtly criticize academies, I think, because he wanted to work with them. But I think the question in terms of you needing to have systemic change and the problem with fragmentation, I mean, I think that is an issue. I mean, for me, the biggest issues though are around, you know, around the control mechanism for academies, and that it's essentially, you know, the defining part of it essentially is a private contract between an academy trust proprietor and the central government, and missing from that is the local community, and you know, and that's kind of reflected in in the way that academies operate on the ground, in the sense that they don't have public meetings for parents. Decision making on which academy trusts which schools are not public. You know, parents even have to fight for kind of discussion papers on this. The whole thing is keeping the service user and the community on the outside, essentially. And I think that's the biggest implication of what's being done, I think. And arguably it's although the previous government in particular would sell this as kind of the profession running schools itself, I think it you know, dangerous. It turns the profession in on itself, becomes quite defensive. You don't have that community perspective kind of sort of involved as of right in terms of the, you know, how schools are operating.
Yeah. Okay, I wonder, can we just rewind a little bit for anybody who's like new to this, right? Or for example, for people who've qualified in the last sort of, you know, 5 or 10 years, say, as teachers, or whose parents or kids are only sort of coming into the school system now, they might not be particularly aware of what the Academy's policy was. And it's sort of, people often talk about Gove when they talk about this and what happened when they came in with the coalition government in 2011. But academies existed under New Labour before that, and it sort of had a long tail. Could you possibly just provide a sort of quite a succinct overview of what this policy is, just before we get into critiquing it and talking about the upsides as well?
So I was covering this, and I was on the Times Educational Supplement at the time, actually. So Labour had come in its first term. It was late 90s. It was sort of struggling a little bit with trying to turn around schools, particularly in secondary schools in urban areas that had a long history of problems. And it tried something called Fresh Start, which is kind of similar to academies, but hadn't quite worked. So in 2000, they announced the Academies policy, which essentially was modelled on an old Thatcher era policy called City Technology Colleges, which had been done at a very small scale. I think there was only 15 CTCs in the end, and that involved businesses coming in and sponsoring schools that were felt to need a radically new approach. So Labour kind of revived that and then launched, I think it's 203 academies they opened during this period 2002 to 2010. And they were all either secondary or all through schools. They're generally in urban areas, and schools that had struggled in the past. And that was where, it was a really radical move and I think the most radical thing they did really was to allow these incoming sponsors essentially complete control over schools. They could name them after themselves. They could have complete control of the governance. And that was quite a radical model to deal with often, decades of problems with these schools. And then Michael Gove comes in 2010 and says, we think this is a good model for all schools. And so suddenly it becomes, from this kind of minority option, it becomes the government's favoured governance structure and method for running schools across the country. And then obviously we saw secondary school academy numbers sort of rocketing in the first years of the coalition government. And then gradually it's expanded, although there's still lots of primary schools, and the majority of primaries are still not academies. They've had that option for 15 years now and have chosen not to academise. But obviously, overall, there's a slight majority now of schools which are academies versus non-academies.
Yeah, and then there are lots of different types, right? Aren't there? So there's a free school is essentially just an academy that just didn't exist before, right?
Yeah,
so a new school. And then there's single trust academies, which is just an academy, like a standalone school.
Yeah.
Of course, multi-academy trust, and there are a few other models. In direct relationship with the DFE. And one thing so Sam Friedman recently wrote a post, didn't he? Like reflecting on his time, because he was an advisor to Gove during that era in the early years of the coalition government, and he sort of said that they didn't really anticipate just the rate at which schools would convert, and that the DFE was just completely overwhelmed, with the capacity to be able to deal with all of these schools that they were suddenly supposed to be supervising.
I mean, there did seem to be sort of financial incentives on the secondaries in the early years of that scheme to convert, and then the DFE always denied it and has always said that they're funded at equivalent levels, but they could find in the detail of the formula, reasons for schools to get quite big, one-off benefits from academizing. So I think that was helping to drive it. But what Sam says does kind of feed into the debate there's really been particularly since the numbers exploded, that it can they all really be supervised from Whitehall? That's a question. Obviously there's 10,000 academies now, so
yeah, interesting. So we've essentially got this now very fragmented system. There is still some schools that are sort of in local authorities. You've got grammar schools, some schools that call themselves grammar schools that aren't grammar schools. Got this very, very diverse, a fragmented system, I think, and nobody really seems to know what to do about that. And so recently, there was talk. Is this still a Labour policy? There was a policy a while ago that was or was it the tail end of the Conservative administration where they just said we're just going to academise all schools by 2030 or something, and then they're going backwards and forwards on that.
I think the Conservatives had that twice. So they said it in 2016. I think all schools were to be academies by 2022. So that didn't happen. They U-turned on that quite quickly after quite a lot of protests, including from some Conservative county councils. That was 2016, and then 2022, they had this policy that all schools were going to be not just in academies, but in multi-academy trusts, or in the process of joining multi-academy trusts by 2030. But again, that was abandoned fairly quickly as well. I mean, it's just, this idea of compulsion, I think, is very controversial. And, the ideology of having to be in trust, I think, is also controversial. But Labour's position now seems to be much less structures focused. So they've said they're sort of agnostic on structures. I mean, they praised MAPS, a fair amount, but obviously there's been debate about the schools bill provisions about in terms of regulation of academies, and just generally they've certainly not been as pro saying we favour multi-academy trusts over other schools and we want all schools to be in MAPS. They're not saying that at all.
Yeah, it's interesting because there are some fairly subtle compulsory measures. I worked in York. I chaired the Education Partnership in York for 3 years. And what changed things for York was that we could not open new schools through the local authority. We could only open new schools as academies. So in an area of growth, as York was, we were forced to have further fragmentation. The whole idea of the Education Partnership was to try and maintain cohesion within the local authority so that we could maximise the exchange good practice, we could share resources, we could do all sorts of things collectively. And as you've pointed out, Warwick, we could respond to the demands and needs of local communities. But we couldn't build new schools, and we couldn't open new schools unless they were academies. And of course, as soon as you say that the consequences of a very poor Ofsted report are academisation, you're making a really, really powerful statement about what the government believes works in terms of structures. So there's a lot of push there, and Labour hasn't addressed either of these issues.
No, although I think on the forced academisation, they're being more pragmatic on it. They've given the Secretary of State more room for manoeuvre on that. I think in that certainly not all schools that fail an Ofsted will have to go into academy status. I mean, the Conservatives have criticised that because they say that it's not good for the Secretary of State to have that kind of freedom because it leaves the way open for judicial review. But I think that's quite an interesting argument. Essentially, you're saying you don't want a minister to be able to look at the circumstances on the ground because it's just too dangerous because it might be subject to legal challenge. I think, it's kind of strange for me to have that as the argument. You're saying you're quite happy to reduce your freedom of taking into account individual circumstances. And I think the free schools one as well. I need to check exactly what the position is on that now, but I think they're not being quite as ideological about it as their predecessors were.
Yeah, yeah. And so we've got a picture now of what this policy is and what it sort of has done, just on a structural basis. It's just changed the governance structure of about half of schools essentially. So if you sort of just had to zoom out and just to give a very broad strokes, like why are you so exercised by this particular policy? And what would you say are the headings of like your main concerns about the impact that this policy has had on schools?
I suppose just to set it up with what kind of drew me in here was basically I was it was in the mid so 2012 to 2017 I was writing it was actually a diary sort of news in brief column for the Guardian's education pages. It became clearer and clearer over that time that people were coming to me with stories particularly about problems with the academy system, not only in academies, but it was sort of overwhelmingly there was problems on the ground with it, or people concerned about what was going on. And to be honest, and towards the end of that time, I thought I've got so much material here. That's why I set my website up, because I actually feel, and I still feel very strongly that people need to be heard. People's ground level stories, scandals, etc., should be out there, and the decision makers should be held to account for what's going on. So I suppose that's the core issue, is that because the Academy's policy essentially takes the school away from the local authority, and it puts it in control of the trust, Academy Trust, and the central government. You essentially, the decision makers are kind of made more remote from those on the end of their decisions, and that sort of naturally creates stories because people get frustrated when they don't seem to be being heard on the ground, because there's no sort of institutional mechanism to do that. Previously, you could have gone to your local councillor. There was at least the notion of a bit more representation within the governing bodies of a school, and that's sort of been taken away completely. And then on the back of that, it seemed to be that those running the schools, although I have to sort of concede that half the schools in England are academies now. Huge numbers of teachers and head teachers are obviously doing a really good job, hugely motivated, and I've got huge respect for them, always have done. The issue is what happens if you're sort of concentrating power over control of sometimes quite large numbers of institutions without sort of very good sort of local accountability, and what happens if the decision making hasn't been well motivated. And that does, that's why people come to me in quite a few cases. And so issues such as the pay rates for those running these trusts, there's never been a national scale for that, and it's clearly money is going upwards. And I think I've shown with research done at a national level, the large multi-academy trusts are spending more per pupil on those senior managers than other schools, and less money is being spent in the classroom within those large trusts. So I think that's hugely important, and just the fact that the Academy's policy can concentrate the power in terms of you can get individuals or their friends essentially in complete control via the governance system of these schools, creates scope for scandals. And we've just seen an endless sort of supply of the scandals from the sector, in its 20 odd years in existence. So that wasn't a very punchy way of summing up what my journalism has tended to focus on. So, I mean, I suppose that with one other thing on fragmentation is it's interesting because the system has essentially fragmented into lots of different organisations now running schools. It's actually quite hard to cover that nationally in a sense, because you're not just talking about one national policy. You're also talking about lots of individual stories that a local paper, might get into, sometimes doesn't get into, and then you've got to try and work out how those, or I try and tell the story about how those individual problems that you might be seeing on the ground then link up to the national policy. And with all the debate about academies, obviously at a very basic level is, should we have academies or should we not? But also there doesn't seem to be much kind of recognition that even if we were to stick with the academies, I think there's lots of ways that you could look to reform them if you were really looking at it through a kind of public interest, local community lens, reporting to our local communities. Schools are here to, service users are very important in all of this. And so we need to remember that in the way that our schools are run, which I don't think is the way essentially it's not the way the system has been set up. For all that, people working in academies, I say, are generally well motivated. The idea of accountability and answerability to local communities is not in the policy at all.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting from a number of angles. I mean, I often talk about the Academy's policy in terms of centralisation of control and decentralisation of blame. So it puts the government into this wonderful position where they can control things through the accountability system, through the direct links with the trusts and all of that. They can also do it through control of curriculum. All of these elements are there. But if things go wrong, it's the school's fault. And it makes it very difficult to question educational policy at that macro level. So there's some fascinating elements in there. And I think the other thing which is interesting to me is that I was a director of children's services. I was the head of education. And I had that real sense of democratic accountability. I had to appear in public
Yeah.
At council meetings, I could be called to justify anything that I'd done, and that element's completely gone. The
Yeah.
other element, which is much more difficult, is that as a director of children's services, particularly, I could mobilize social work, I could mobilize community services, I could take a much more holistic approach to school improvement than I could have done as the director of an academies trust, where I would have had to buy in these services, which would have made it a budgetary issue. So
Mm.
there's lots that we've lost, I think, around the whole idea of local authority control. And the last thing to throw into this is the thing that really, in a sense, confuses me is that I'm also seeing some remarkable progress in some of the academy trusts. And I'm seeing things being done by really well motivated people and done really quickly with genuine and positive impacts, which would have been much more difficult for me to achieve, despite all the resources and accountability that I had as a director of children's services. The sheer scale would have defeated me in terms of making that level of change. So there's a real tension there, I think,
Yeah.
because we have seen that liberation,
Mm.
we have seen the response to that, and in fact, in Gove's terms, he created loads of Frankensteins who've
Yeah.
now come back and
Is
monstered them.
I would be interested in terms of what's kind of things you're talking about there in terms of what the multi academy trusts have been doing.
Well, for example, I was involved in the Next Decade event, which James and I were talking about before you came on, and that was run by Wellspring Academy, and they're taking in children who have been excluded by other trusts, other authorities. They're making a commitment to a particular approach based on kindness, based on trauma-informed practice. They've got a range of provisions. They're taking on schools that are characterised by significant disadvantage. They're investing heavily in them. They're taking an approach which would not have found favour with Nick Gibb, if that's a suitable measure of how a school approaches things. They're doing all of that, and they're having a positive impact in terms of outcomes as well. And we're able to
They don't
evidence
exclude
that.
either, do they?
No, they've never excluded. So that's a good example. I was with the Prince Regent Street Trust recently, working with them. They're another good example of a school that have taken on, a trust that have taken on schools that are faced by really significant challenges and tried to deal with these in a positive way with, again, positive outcomes. So there's a real tension around that, because sometimes the trusts have an agility that a local authority might lack.
Yeah, I get your point on that. I mean, I will also say that obviously in the context we've been in the last 15 years, local authorities haven't had the money to invest in projects and just general support that, so MATs have drawn in a lot of people, they have drawn in, I guess that it's the favoured career progression for a lot of people now. So there's a lot of dynamism coming from that. I would agree with that. It's just I think that doesn't negate some of the negatives around the policy, which I think could be addressed even if you kept the policy. You could make decision making a lot more open. You could all kinds of. One interesting idea that's been put forward over the years is that you, instead of at the moment where you essentially control of multi-academy trusts is basically formally goes to a group of people called the members, who are essentially like the shareholders in a company, who have the rights including appointing and dismissing academy directors. You could open that out and make every parent within a community a member. And I think actually if you did something like that, you would get rid of probably about 90% of the scandals that I've covered over the years, because if those at the top of the trust started behaving in the wrong way, the community just wouldn't tolerate it. But you don't have that at the moment. So I don't think it's integral to what you're saying was happening within MATs that are doing good things. I don't think it's integral that they have that. I don't think I would open up governing body meetings to the public if they want to attend, with confidential items kept for afterwards. I don't think that's. I just think, essentially, I think the system has decided that democracy, in terms of involvement in the running of our schools, is not really the way that the government wanted to go, and it's kind of moved away from that. And I think if you went more down that road, I don't think you would weaken the system at all.
No, and that's hugely helpful, Warwick, because I think what we've seen with the Academy's policy, certainly as exercised by Gove and others, has been classic neoliberalism. It has been about the removal of public control and public accountability, and the replacement with the possibility of profit and private control. And I think that while there are a number of people who've really subverted that, they're doing it despite the system rather than because of it.
Yeah, and I think, yes, and things like becoming more inclusive and not excluding and that sort of thing, that's great. Obviously, I think schools should be inclusive organisations, but the setup now it has incentivized schools and academy trusts to act in an opposite way, because it gives huge praise to schools which are raising results and sort of penalizes those that aren't. So if you are, the cynical way one of the cynical methods to go about boosting results is to essentially get rid of the children that you don't think are going to help you get those results. And that there's no doubt that has been going on. And when you fragment the system and have competing organizations, and when you, as I say, you've got such high stakes being given to sort of institutional measures of success, then that's what tends to happen. So so the local authority essentially could be a sort of a referee in that kind of system and sort of try and stop some of the worst bits of it happening, because it doesn't have it's just operating across the local area. It doesn't have an incentive as a trust would have to sort of grow schools and try and become more successful. And it doesn't have those kind of incentives. But you've made those local authorities weaker in the way that they can police that system, because they are more remote from it and they have less power. So, as I say, I completely take your point. It's great if there's good practice out there, but it is kind of working against the system, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been at the thick end of that. Like I was working in a school that underwent a process of forced academization, where a very popular and successful head teacher who had just reported the best set of results in that school's history, but they weren't best ever enough for the incoming academy chain, and he was hoofed out in an unceremonious fashion. And we were sort of it was quite a brutal process, and the process of academization was brutal. And then what happened when we became an academy, and lots of people started getting fired. People were disappearing from the site. People were just like disappeared off the site. And that board where people all their photos are, the entrance hall, would come in and people's faces would be replaced with the school logo. And we were like, it used to be there. It was like being in some weird sci-fi thing. It was like people are being disappeared, and we're not even like, there was this very terrible culture of fear. In that following May, 50% of the teachers left that school.
Gosh.
And the ones who remained, it was not for want of trying. And that school was, you were just talking about massaging the figures and what have you. And that school was carrying out data fraud. They were putting kids on guest status, the status that you put on a kid if they're a dual placement or if they're a school refuser. Kids who were coming to the school every day had been guested so that their data wouldn't count.
Gosh.
And that came out, and there was a bit of a scandal about it. But the academy chain still runs that school. And I think that one of the things that, there's two things that I think are important to note. One that you've already mentioned is the movement of money upwards, as you very delicately put it. And it's the creation of this managerial class that sits above the level of schools. There are academy chains that describe their head teachers as middle managers who aren't even allowed to make decisions about how the tables are organized or what goes on the walls. So it's very sort of micromanaged, and there's this managerial class of people who are often on six-figure salaries, sometimes multiples of that. There was one recently, I don't know if this was one of your stories, Warwick, but I saw one where there was they bought themselves like a fleet of Teslas.
That wasn't mine.
And so on. And that sort of thing's quite commonplace, right? It's not sort of outright corruption, but it's not a good use of public funds. And like you say, when schools budgets are to the bone. So that's one thing, is like you say, the movement of money upwards and the creation of a managerial class. And the second thing is, there's no evidence, as far as I can see, that academies perform any better than state schools. There's data you see some studies that come out that suggest that state schools perform better. Some people sort of contest that and say, well, essentially it's contested, but there is no clear evidence that academies perform better than non-academies. And that brings us, interestingly, so onto the schools bill. I'd really like to hear your thoughts on the bill that's going through Parliament at the moment, and the implications, because it carries some implications for academies. And perhaps there's a way into that. Gove and Gibb, who we've already mentioned, have both expressed very strong opposition to this. I think Gove described it as a tragedy. Gibb described it as educational vandalism. And I'd just be very interested to hear your thoughts on what's in this school bill. What are the potential implications for academies that are being mooted? And it's in the Lords now, isn't it? It's in one of the final steps going through to becoming legislation. So let's get onto the schools bill.
Yeah. Okay. Where to start with that? I mean, vandalism. I mean, it's a sort of a classic one. It seems like the politicians come in and make some quite broad brush claims, which at very sort of high level claims about any kind of diminution of academy freedoms, as they would see it, as are just terrible. And this has been the best policy we've had in education for decades, and why are you reversing it? But you actually look at what's being done, and I think it's pretty modest what the government's actually looking to do. I mean, they've got so on the curriculum, so all schools will, including all academies, will have to follow the national curriculum. And you look at that, on the surface of it, it's a big thing, because obviously, as I've mentioned, more than 50% of schools are academies now. Academies don't have to follow the national curriculum. So changing that, you would think it's a big deal. But actually, I think most schools are following, most academies are broadly following the national curriculum, and so it's only ensuring that that's the case in perhaps the minority of schools where it might not be happening. And I have covered I certainly think a couple of cases where I think parents it's right that they should have that safeguard. One that particularly sticks in my mind is Future Academies, which is a group of 10 schools that's set up and basically controlled by the former Academies Minister, Lord Nash, and his wife. And I was covering its case of its 3 primary schools a few years back, where they were, the children were not getting access to ICT. I'm told by multiple people, and it seems sort of borne out on the ground, is because the sponsors of the trust were not really very much in favour of it, and parents have written a letter saying that they were concerned about the marginalisation of this subject and other subjects as well, alongside with the sort of general direction of travel of these academies. And what could they do? Those in charge of the academy didn't want to offer it, so that essentially when you're not saying that school has to offer all the subjects of the national curriculum, you are leaving it in the gift of those in charge. And sometimes they are not, particularly, the parental voice isn't necessarily going to be heard. So I think there's a lot to be said for that. If we think that there should be a national curriculum covering thousands of schools, then why not? As Estelle Morris said in the Commons the other day, in the House of Lords the other day, a national curriculum, the clue is in the name. It's either covering all schools or it's not, I think. So anyway, but I think generally that's, most schools it won't have a huge effect of, and certainly with the paying conditions clause of the bill, where all schools now have to follow national pay and conditions arrangements, has been the thinking behind that within the bill. And again, that's covering academies who haven't had to follow them. The reality on the ground is that the most academy trusts do follow national pay and conditions. The only way in which they tend to depart from sort of any national arrangement is for the pay for their senior leaders, but that's because there are no national pay and conditions for the senior leaders, and that's not going to change. So again, this is not going to affect very many schools. Again, sometimes it's said, so why are we doing it then? And again, I would come back to, so there are some outliers that I come across. Again, I'm thinking of one very high profile school, which I found a few years ago was only paying didn't basically believe in teachers going off sick at all, and was only paying them the statutory sickness pay of up to £100 a week if they did so. So I think, if national pay and conditions are being followed in all schools, again, that kind of thing couldn't happen. So again, it seems quite sensible, but not affecting that many academies. I think those are the two kind of there's a headline things. I mean, schools are going to have to. All schools will have to have where there is still be allowed. All schools will still be allowed to employ unqualified teachers, but where at the moment local authority schools, if you're unqualified, you have to be in the process of gaining qualifications. That rule hasn't applied to academies, and it will now apply to academies.
Right.
Again, I don't think this is,
not earth-shattering stuff.
massive. No. Yeah.
I mean, I think this is really interesting, and I'm so grateful to you, Warwick, because one of my concerns is that Gove was so radical and so bullish in terms of what he did, that he pulled the system so far out of whack that it's impossible to ever get it back in again. It's that kind of really classical neoliberalism destructiveness. And I think what you've done is you've set out elements that could have been in the schools bill around accountability to communities, around the changes in governance. And to be honest, you're the most constructive person I've heard around how we can bring together some of the stronger elements of local authority governance and an academy-based structure. And I think it's highly unfortunate that the government hasn't picked up on these. I love that idea of parents having the same rights as shareholders. I love that idea of those who have a genuine interest in the school having a representation on it. There's so much in that would make important change, I think, and would be welcome and I think encouraging for those academies that are, I think, moving forward in a really constructive way. So very, very grateful to you for that. I just wish other people had been listening to you as closely as I have. We might have seen a different schools bill.
I mean, it does make me wonder whether, whether the bill itself is, it's been too quick, this process of going into it. I mean, and to be fair, I mean, the critics, particularly on the Conservative side, I was looking at the Lord's debate from last week. It's sort of one consistent criticism of the government has been that people can't see the case for what it does hasn't been made. And while I think, as I say, I think there is a case for all of the measures in it, and I think they're quite modest, but I don't necessarily think the government has set it out. Those arguments, but I think partly, possibly because they are nervous of kind of, I don't know, the more detail they get into, the more they potentially, annoy what is now a very large multi-academy trust sector, and so they'd rather not go into it in detail. But as you say that, I think, well, it was sort of crying out for a big sort of investigation to happen beforehand, and a kind of this very, very complex system. I think everyone would agree it is quite complex. Could have been looked at in detail. Kind of questions asked about, is it serving? What purposes is it meant to be serving, and is it serving them on all aspects well? And then we could have once you've had that investigation, then you sort of take forward some approaches to try and resolve it. So yeah.
Interesting that a government that was apparently obsessed with evidence-based policy, now that it's in opposition, feels no need to look at any evidence at all around the effectiveness of what you describe as one of the major policy changes in the last 35 years. It's just utterly fascinating.
Right.
Yeah.
Likewise, their repeated support for grammar schools, for which there's not a shred of evidence that it's a good idea to have grammar schools, and the many deleterious effects that policy can have on communities and quality of outcomes and what have you. And so we've just been joined by Naomi. Hello, Naomi.
Hi, James.
How are you doing? I'm
okay.
Mansell, have you met Warwick before?
I have. I've even met him in person.
Have you?
Yes.
Oh,
indeed.
okay.
Yes.
But does he remember meeting you?
I think so.
James had a really unfortunate experience earlier.
All those years.
I think it's more recently, to be honest.
Okay, well, It's great to have you with us, Naomi. So we've been having a very interesting conversation that's been mainly about the Academy's policy, and it was sort of a potted history of the Academy's policy. And we've just now been talking about some of the implications of the Academy's policy. Sorry, I beg your pardon. Some of the implications for academies of the schools bill that's going through currently. And that I think we've sort of, it feels like we've sort of tied those up, and we've talked about them. And essentially, the Warwick's analysis was that there's nothing particularly earth-shattering here, and that there are some very loud voices. Gove and Gibb described it as a tragedy for academies and educational vandalism. And Warwick is just pointing out that actually it's a series of really quite modest proposals about making sure that there's, you know, that the pay and condition standards are implemented, that all schools follow the national curriculum, the clues in the name, you know, nothing particularly radical in these proposals, but people are policing that ground very, very aggressively, it would seem. But most of the heat, if you like, that's been coming off this bill has been the way that it affects people who aren't particularly in the school system, in particular homeschoolers. And I know that you're very involved in that world. So should we start just by asking you to do a brief introduction of yourself, Naomi, in case there are a very vanishingly small number of people who haven't heard of you and the amazing work that you do. Could you please give us a quick introduction to who you are and what you do?
Yes, I'm glad you said that, James, because I was expecting you to say, can you give me a quick synopsis of the bill? And I was like, oh, that's quite a thing to start off with. But no, I can manage myself. That's okay. So I'm Dr. Naomi Fisher. I am a clinical psychologist. I specialize in autism and trauma as a clinician, but I home educated my own children, and they now attend a democratic school. And I am very interested in the intersection between education, psychology. I've written 2 books about learning outside the school system, changing our minds and a different way to learn. And I work now largely with parents of children who are struggling in the school system, who are outside the school system. So my real interest, I think, came about because of seeing as a clinical psychologist, so I'm located in healthcare, I'm a specialist in mental health, that we were being asked effectively to kind of treat children, fix them and send them back into a school system, which seemed to be damaging them. And yet there was no feedback system for that. There's no, psychologists are not really involved. Mostly when talking about education, we're kind of out there. So we would be seeing the children, but have no way of feeding back the impact of what was going on in schools on the mental health of the children that we were seeing.
Right. Yes, indeed. And could you perhaps give us a sense of the scale? One thing that I've been really had my mind blown by, and this really connects, I think, in various ways to what we've been discussing with Warwick, is there's like the scale of the phenomenon that you're describing of like working with families of children who are so-called like not fine in school. I think is that the name of the webinar that you just come off about?
Yes, my child's not fine in school. Yes,
my child is not fine in school, and there's this huge Facebook group, isn't there, called Not Fine in School? Because that's the phrase that's so often used by teachers, and when parents express concerns and they go, oh well, they're fine in school, you know.
Yeah.
But can you just give us a sense as to like the scale of this phenomenon?
I think it's huge, really. It's one of these things which now, you know, I say that 10 years ago, if you mentioned a child who wasn't thriving at school, people would have kind of looked sympathetic and nodded and said, oh, you know, bullying or something. Now I find if I mention it, everybody has either knows a child or knows a friend's child or has their own child who is really struggling with school. It just seems to be part of the zeitgeist at the moment that a lot of children are really struggling at school, and are, unfortunately, I think the ways that we are approaching that as a society are often making the problems worse rather than better. So I don't have numbers, but the way I think about it is that we've got a lot of children. One of the ways that we're responding to that as a society is we're locating the problems in the children rather than in the schools. So we have ever increasing numbers of children being identified as having some kind of SEND, special educational needs, disabilities. A lot of those children would be the same children as the ones I'm talking about as being not fine at school, because the way that we're dealing with these children, rather than saying, oh, we've got a lot of children who aren't fine at school, perhaps we should think about what's happening at school, we tend to instead be saying, what's wrong with the children?
I I think it's really interesting to ask if there's any pattern here. One of the things that we've been talking about, Naomi, is that the system now is just so fragmented and so diversified. There are clearly clusters of schools and academies trusts which are, trauma informed. They're based on positive regard. We've got a totally different model, I guess, exemplified by Michaela, which is a real focus on aspiration, ambition, demand, control, all of that. Are you seeing any pattern reflected? Because, with that level of diversity, I don't think it's helpful to talk about schools. Is there any sense that you have that kids thrive better in some environments than others?
I think children are incredibly diverse, and I don't think there's ever going to be one sort of environment that works for all children. But I do think that something that our school system as a whole shares, even with the schools that are more nurturing and the schools that are less nurturing, is that they are all being judged on a narrow range of test results. And that's happening more through the whole system. So primary schools as well as secondary schools are being judged on how well children perform in these particular tests. And I think there's, when you talk to schools who are really doing things differently, who are much more flexible or much more relational in their approach, they'll often talk about it as if they're having to do that as almost kind of like guerrilla educators, out with kind of bucking the system, because the system isn't pushing us to do that. The system is pushing us to get the best exam results. And the schools like Michaela get talked about as the kind of ultimate gold's the best, because that's what we see as the best. And I think that's where the big problem is coming about, that we've got the way we're measuring it is getting increasingly narrow and increasingly rigid. And in fact, what children need, and perhaps particularly this generation of children need who have been through COVID, is more flexibility in the system. And we don't really have a system that's got that built in.
Unfortunately, we have a person in this podcast who's written a book called The Tyranny of Testing, or contributed to a book called The Tyranny of Testing.
Oh, so, yeah.
Warwick, I mean, is that echoing the kind of concerns that you've raised?
It's interesting in a way. I mean, that book was full title is Education Among Numbers: The Tyranny of Testing, which was published in 2007. And to be honest, I think that's still very much there. Obviously, schools are held to account by their results. It hasn't gone away. But I think sort of on top of it, you've got now academy trusts, which can be run in multi-academy trusts, can be run in quite top-down ways, and they've got very sort of uniform behaviour policies. Even before you get into the discussion about whether the content of those policies is right, I think the very fact that they're sort of imposed from the top, and therefore very rigid, or can be very rigid, I think is, I think it should be sort of factored into any debate about whether this, pupil well-being, because it can feel very much as if everything's being done to these young people rather than them being sort of involved in a sense of kind of having a voice in all of this. So that's one thing I would say. And there's no doubt, I think the kind of traditionalist kind of quite strict agenda was favoured by the last government and was pushed quite hard. And again, is that I don't think we've ever had any proper investigation in terms of actually the impact on young people. And I would say, it's interesting what Naomi was saying about the, not having any figures, but I do think we have data now increasingly from the international, ironically, probably from the international testing studies. If you look at the background data that they're collecting in terms of questionnaires that they're doing with the young people who are tested, it's actually really concerning in terms of data for England and the UK. Just looking at, I wrote a story last week about what the TIMSS study was, probably the second best known study of international testing study. And they found that basically both that study and the better known PISA studies showing that the life satisfaction or satisfaction with school indices have been going downhill faster in this country and faster than other countries. So in the last round of the TIMSS study, nearly half of England's 14-year-olds said they disagreed with the statement, "I like being in school," which is a figure that's basically doubled over 8 years between 2015 and 23. And at primary level, it was 28% saying that 10-year-olds compared to 14% in 2015. So, ironically, we've been talking about Michael Gove and Nick Gibb talking about how academies reversing any aspect of the academy's policy is educational vandalism, and they would kind of point to international test results as improving over that period. Well, I think they also need to be considering what it looks like, the troubles we've been having with in terms of pupil well-being, all of which completely bears out, I think, the points that Naomi was making.
Yeah, I wonder if we could. I'd like to explore this a little bit, because it feels like there are dots to be connected here. But like you say, there isn't a huge amount of robust research on this. And for example, in particular, the Academy's policy. So in recent years, I know that you write a lot, Naomi, and speak a lot about the sort of the uptick that we've seen in very sort of like strict approaches to behavior management in schools. There's lots of schools that have like very like high volume detentions, where they have like hundreds of kids in detentions every night after school, often for minor things, like if they don't have a spare pen in their bag, or if they smirk at their friend across a silent corridor, or if they have the wrong coloured socks on, and what have you. And there's lots of that, and there are lots of children and young people who are sort of terrified of like doing the wrong thing, of making a mistake and so on. And that does seem to be something that I've seen a lot more of in the last 8 or 10 years or so, across that timeline that you describe, Warwick, where there's a doubling of in the number of kids who are saying that I don't like school. And that does seem to be something that's quite unique to this country. And I don't think that you could just say, oh, well, that increase in dissatisfaction was due to COVID, because if so, why is it not happening in other countries? And so that feels like there's something in that, but it's more of a hunch that I have, really, than anything that I can point to data on. What do you both make of that? I'll start with you, Naomi, and then go across to Warwick, and David, chip in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think there's been an uptick in this, like I would call them kind of hyper controlling, or extraordinarily high control schools. And it does seem to be an England, I don't even know if it's a UK wide thing, actually. Yeah. And I think it's partly been due to the championing of places like Michaela, and the showing that places like that do get really good exam results. Whenever I talk about this, people usually say things like, oh, and happier kids will get better exam results. And actually I say, no, possibly not. And we need to be able to accept that perhaps actually happiness is more important than getting the top exam results. You can come out, I know as a psychologist, a child can come out of school with top exam results, totally unable to function because they've got such serious mental health problems, and they crash. And we've had this sort of idea where we loop young person's well-being through school success. So often people will say, a successful, happy child is one who is doing well at school. Well, that isn't going to work for everybody. For a start, a large percentage of children aren't going to do well at school because school is a competitive system. So whatever we do, they aren't all going to get 9s at GCSE. It's just not possible. If they did, they'd recalibrate the GCSEs to stop them all getting 9s. So that's a kind of fool's errand, to say everybody's got to get top exam results. And because we've got this idea that the way to be happy, the way to have a fulfilling life is through these exam results, sometimes people talk as if any amount of unhappiness is justified because of that. People will say that to me, well, they'll thank us later on. They won't thank, the kind of let them off, let them down kind of mentality. If you let them get away with not having their green pen, then they may not learn how to perform in a job, and then they'll be grateful for what I've done. There's a kind of, that has been an ethos, and I think a deliberate ethos, but also some of these schools were very good at collecting data to show that high control gets good exam results. And everybody else saw that perhaps this was the way to get good exam results, and they've jumped on the bandwagon. And I think, I thought when I first started hearing about it, that it would be a very few schools, and that this was a kind of, an exception. And now everywhere I go, people kind of come up and whisper to me. I had a psychotherapist whisper to me in an event a couple of weeks ago. She said, I can't tell you what school I work in because I might lose my job. But we have lines painted along the corridors. They have to walk along those lines in silence, and they're not allowed any word. They'll be in detention. And I'm a counsellor, I'm at the school, and I hear about the distress that this is causing, but I can't do anything about it because that's not my role. And I feel like, it's like an unspoken, the side effects of this are unspoken, and the effects that everybody wants to see, the exam results, they are there. I think it's indisputable, unfortunately, that if you harshly control young people's behaviour and you coach them and you make them focus on nothing except from exam results, they're probably going to get better exam results. The question for me is that worth it?
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, there's an awful lot in that. I certainly think I agree with you, Naomi, about the scale of it. Although people coming to me with sort of extreme cases sometimes that I've covered, like children being in an isolation room and not able to turn around for the whole day, which seems to me to be quite shocking. But the general sort of sense of control and heavy use of detentions, this idea that you need to sort of, that reward and punishment is the way that you're going to get the best out of children, I think is quite pervasive, especially with the secondary school system. So yeah, even though sometimes you don't see quite the extremes, I think it is sort of a less sort of explosive level or controversial level. It does come through across the system. But I'd also pick up on what you were saying, James, about that feeling that it felt like a hunch rather than data. I think that is really true about what's going on with these behaviour approaches, and actually are they succeeding is the key question. And actually, staggeringly, I don't think nobody's really seems to be actually investigating whether that's the case. And I think you could look at exam results, but as Naomi said, is that the only thing we're looking for here? I don't think so. I think what you should be doing is actually talking to the young people, trying to get some kind of longitudinal sense of what's been going on with them. I just brought to mind, it was a very interesting passage within a very interesting report that I covered recently. It came out from last year by I think it's the organisation Pro Bono Economics, which has been arguing actually for the measurement of well-being to be compulsory in schools. And actually the Liberal Democrats in particular have been pushing this point during the passage of the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill through Parliament. Quite a few people backing this idea, and this report had a line within it that said, we've not tried to measure the impact of these behavioural interventions. We've not sort of set up any, looked at schools that are doing it, set up a control group and trying to track exactly what's been going on, which is extraordinary. I have raised this on social media a few times, and people would raise various issues about how you could never possibly measure it, and it's too difficult. But we investigate everything. These policies, some of them are clearly having a very, very big impact on pupils' experience of schools. Advocates would say for the better, critics would very much disagree with that. So why aren't we looking at it properly? I mean, I would think an incoming government, this is something they should absolutely be looking at, because as Naomi has said, it's really having a big impact on individual pupils. So let's look at it properly and independently.
Yeah, really, really interesting, because it's for any blues fans out there, it's the Bonnie Raitt question about what is success. And the more narrowly you define it, the more you encourage that kind of narrow certainty that we talked about in the Four Nations podcast that we did recently. Graham Donaldson, who was the advisor to Welsh Government in educational reform, talked about England being characterised by a narrow certainty. So very small range of ideas focusing on a very small range of outcomes. And we've lost that sense of that wider purpose of schools. Ties back into two things, Warwick, that you've talked about. One, you used the term longitudinal, and that longitudinal analysis is absolutely critical. When I was a teacher, I got very good results. I taught in Scotland, so higher was the benchmark. And I got lots of kids to get better, higher results than they actually should have done. They then went on to higher education and they crashed. My failure rate in the first year of higher education was higher than the national average. I had more kids going from my classes to do history at university who weren't coping in first year. Because all I'd done was I'd taught them to clear the hurdle. I hadn't taught them to finish the race. So the longitudinal element, I think, is hugely, hugely significant.
Mm.
And the other thing is when you filled out the title in your book in Education by Numbers, one of the things I talk about constantly is that we've begun to talk endlessly in education in the language of accountancy. So we get baselining, we get target setting, we get all of that language, as I keep saying, that failed the bank so badly in 2008. And we've ceased to talk about education in the language of poetry, which is the language of transformation, of creativity, of constructiveness, of that whole wider sense of success that I think should characterize any serious education system. And I got so excited, my microphone fell over. So, there we go. Rant over. Back to you guys.
I mean, part of the problem with that, I think, is that as a reporter, data is very easy to, it's very easy to write about, in the sense that, I can write about a school, although I've always been sort of skeptical about a school that's always completely transformed its results and wanted, but a lot of the media coverage will be see that as quite an easy story to write, whereas talking in terms of a school that has become more poetic or it's not quite as easy to capture. And certainly when you look at sort of national data sets, getting everything into a spreadsheet and that you can just sum up, with an average number across thousands of institutions is very easy. And so you can see how things get, data can kind of drive public perception. I mean, a part of we've talked about Michaela, and big part of the reason that it's got done so well in terms of coverage is just because it gets this Progress 8 indicator is kind of off the scale, and therefore that is seen as proof that it's a great school and other schools should follow it. Whereas actually, there's always questions, there's always things to dig into, but the data kind of can encourage a kind of one-dimensional kind of view of things. I mean, for the record, I think Michaela does have, I'm sure, has got very good teaching, but it's got quite a narrow range of subjects I've written. It's offering to pupils, so it's not. And if you look at the Ofsted inspection about that school, the inspector's notes sort of make that clear. But again, you get sort of only one-dimensional coverage. This is a fantastic school, or it's not a fantastic school. It's a really bad school, and it's just generally, I think you need to have a bit more nuance on this.
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. I've had this conversation or something a bit like it a few times before on this podcast, and it just feels like it's politically very difficult to see. Like the thing that you were talking about, Naomi, about like we've got this very narrow conception of what success is, and I love that language that it's threaded through the needle of educational of exam results, basically. And I've seen somebody else express the idea. They sort of said the best pastoral care for a young person is a great set of results, as though and you can, and it's sort of like the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? And the people who say that, they really think it, and with some justification, you could say that a kid who's born into dire circumstances that's not of their control. That's the way that the language is. Any talk of any sort of reform is often very heightened. It's like, but how would this impact kids from disadvantaged backgrounds? And it's often that's the way that the status quo is often policed and maintained. It's like any suggestion that we should do anything different would increase inequality of outcomes, and that would be really bad. And people are, genuinely very concerned about that. And like you say, Warwick, exam results have the benefit of, like, you can measure them very easily. You can compare one school with another, and it's an easy mechanism by which you can hold people to account. And it's really hard to see how we're going to move past that to something that where we, essentially you would have to have somebody at the dispatch box in Parliament arguing for a policy that would lower exam results, right? and that's just they're beyond a hiding to nothing. You can imagine the Daily Mail, and so this is a really hard question, but like, how do you think it is even possible to turn the dial on this and to change, to broaden people's perceptions and to start looking at some more well-rounded set of outcome figures, or is this just politically undoable? Like, is this a council of despair? Like, what like, help me out here.
I like that what you're saying about, yes, you'd have to be arguing for lower exam results, because I sometimes feel like that, because it's like whenever you argue for change, people are like, but what about the exam results? And I do think that you have to be able to say, we just have to be able to put those to one side, because they are never all going to get top exam results. And I almost think if everybody could just understand that premise, and I sometimes think people don't, because they don't understand averages, they don't understand statistics, they don't understand that the way that exams are graded, does mean that to do well means to do better than everybody else. It doesn't just mean there isn't just a doing well, you have to do better than everybody else. And therefore, it's not possible for everybody to do that. I do think if we actually knew that and accepted that, then we'd have this question of, so how do we have an education system that accounts for all of those children, including the ones who are going to go to school for 11, 12, 13 years and are not going to get good exam results at the end, because they are going to be there no matter how brilliant the schools are. And it is just because even if they did all start doing amazingly well, they'd just recalibrate the exams. So, and I sometimes feel like we don't properly understand that it's not possible for everybody to be looped through that needle. And therefore, it's not really, I don't think it's good enough to say the best set of pastoral care is your exam results, because what happens to the kid who doesn't get them? They still need something. And when I've talked to teachers, I think teachers are encouraged to be quite focused on those end of term, end of year, end of school exams, and then not to think at the next level. So it's really interesting, David, to hear you saying about your young people crashing in that first year, because that's what I suspect about these high control school environments, that you take away all agency from young people in order to get the best exam results that you can get. And then unfortunately, or fortunately, they go on into adult life, where really what makes the difference is that sense of agency. Can I do, the sense that drives you to do it? And if you haven't developed that sense through your teenage years, then you crash, because you don't know what to do. You don't know how to manage. And when I talk to teachers sometimes about how the beliefs, as a clinical psychologist, the beliefs that a young person forms about themselves through education are what I see the residue of 10 years later. So, they won't remember their GCSE history curriculum. They will not remember most of what they learned at school, but they will remember that they felt really stupid, or they will remember that they thought of themselves as somebody who wasn't capable of learning, or they'll remember that they learned to think about themselves as someone who was good at learning, and that they still have 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later. And yet teachers aren't thinking about that because they're not being encouraged to. And that's what I'd like to see us looking at in terms of outcomes. I'd like to see us with the kind of aim of each young person leaves school thinking about themselves as someone who's capable and can learn, even if they failed their exams, which is quite a challenge if you think about it. Right.
Yeah, I think it was interesting. You were talking about, pupils essentially being sort of spoon-fed towards exam success and then struggling afterwards. I've got a vague memory of something I've read about charter schools in the US. Charter schools, US equivalent of academies, and again, very sort of high control environments, some of them, and then students having struggled at university, and then there's even talk about them having a sort of a hotline that they could call their old teachers to get help with things, which seemed a bit slightly strange. And I think that was the kind of context for a kind of a rethink on some of those approaches, actually. So absolutely, I agree. The sense of agency, the sense of self-direction is got to be important. I mean, I've certainly felt it at school, and it's obviously really, really important in life to foster that. So in terms of, James, you mentioned about the accountability change. I mean, gosh, that makes me go back into what I was thinking about endlessly for my book. How could we reform this system? And it is tough, and I would sort of slightly dodge it at the moment, in the sense that I think maybe I just was writing about something much more concrete, actually, in terms of something specific that can be done about the exam system today, which is actually that we've got the DFE's assessment and curriculum and assessment review going on at the moment, and as part of that, all three of the exam boards now, the mainstream GCSE and A-level exam boards are now arguing for reduction in assessment. So at GCSE, so just the scale of assessment that and the number of exams that children have to face. So the CEO of the OCR board was telling MPs on the Education Select Committee yesterday that that's what should happen. And she's got some quite specific ways in which she thought that the number of exams could reduce, the number of papers that the children take and the length of those papers could reduce without sacrificing any of the sort of reliability around that. So, again, if you start, and she said that would raise young people's well-being, because lots of people are stressed by just how, there's a lot of stress on that process for their young people, to state the obvious, and reducing the number would reduce that a bit. So I think change could happen if you start from the young person and what their experience of education is like. And I suppose one of the defining things I found within however long I've been as an education journalist is, sadly, we don't start from the student experience. We don't at all. We start from the politics of education generally. We don't think about we don't really investigate or think about what this is actually looking for the child looks like for the child. So hopefully we could maybe that will change, and the very fact that the bill is called the Children's Wellbeing and Schools Bill perhaps suggests that, at least rhetorically, at least this government was prepared to look at it, although I do think that much of the content of the bill and the debate around it really hasn't looked at children's wellbeing at all, which is a shame.
Three or four things to throw into the mix. One of them is what they did in Scotland. So the only education indicator that made it into the top 20 indicators that government was going to look at to measure progress in Scotland was positive destinations. So rather than look at where children were at the end of school, in terms of exam results or whatever, they looked at whether they moved on into higher education, further education, training, or not in education, training, NEET, whatever. That made a significant difference in terms of how schools approach children. It's not a panacea, but it made a significant shift, because it meant that schools were challenged to see how well they served children for life, rather than how well they served children within schools. Second thing, I think, is that we could move significantly away from the norm referenced approach that we have. There's lots and lots of examples, but my absolute favourite is that there was one year, again in Scotland, where there were two higher maths exams. There was a traditional and an alternative. The pass rate in the alternative exam was 35%. Young people who got more than 35% in the alternative maths higher passed. I think the pass mark in the traditional higher was somewhere in the 40% region. But in everybody's heads, publicly, kids who passed got more than 50%. And we are not at all open about the extent to which we gerrymander the results so that we get the patterns of attainment that we're supposed to get. If we were prepared to move to a more criterion reference system, where there would be much greater flexibility, that would change things significantly, because you can't close the attainment gap. You just change who's on either side of it if you have a norm reference system. Really interesting. And the other thing that interestingly sits alongside that is that we don't trial new assessments. So what teachers do is they teach to the test. So if you've got an A-level which places great emphasis on recall and understanding, people will develop recall and understanding. The better they do that, the better kids will do in the exam. Simple as that. And people will not change their practice unless they're rewarded for it. So what we need to do is we need to say, here are much more flexible assessment systems that we're going to try. This is what the exams will now look like. And you let people know that earlier so that they can make that change. We've not been good at that because it places too many demands on the system. And the last one is a very small thing that I've been encouraging people within schools to do. And that's rather than look at who's achieving what all the time, sometimes simply ask the question, who's currently thriving? Because whenever you look at data and achievement, it's a post-mortem on something that's already happened. If you ask the question, who's thriving currently, you're asking a diagnostic question. And it then allows you to ask the question, and why are they thriving? And it also forces you to ask the question, what does thriving look like? And I think if you take these four elements together, one very much at school level, another very much at policy and national level, you begin to get something that offers accountability, but also offers the possibility of change.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you all very much. I feel a lot less despairing now than I did a few moments ago. There are some really, really tangible, practical ideas there. I love the idea of just reducing the number of exams. It just seems like it's a really sensible way just to create a little bit more time and space in the school day for like more open-ended forms of human connection, for play, for meaning making, for undertaking passion projects and what have you. And I think that would go a really long way. I really want to use the last bit of this time that we have together, if I may, to come back to the schools bill and to think about the implications of this beyond the school gates, as it were, and especially the implications for home educating families. And I know that so this is where I ask you that big question, Naomi, that you were daunted by earlier. And I know that there's a lot in here around the introduction of a national register for home educated families, increased local authority oversight, home inspections to assess the suitability of home education environments, the right to deny or revoke the right to home education, and so on. So there's this sense that this is really tightening accountability now in the home education sector as well as within the education sector. So let's talk about this. What are the, again, could we possibly just start with the nuts and bolts, sort of like, is there anything that I've missed there? What are the key proposals in this schools and wellbeing bill? And then let's get into some of the concerns that homeschooling families have about this bill.
Yes, so there are a few key concerns. I mean, there are a few key things that they're talking about introducing. One is a countrywide register of all home educated children, which is something that's kind of come on and off the cards for a long time, and is something which would impose a serious data collection issue on local authorities. Actually, most local authorities already hold local lists of home educated children, but this is kind of a mandatory list of all home educated children across the whole country that they've proposed. There's also basically a proposal of a shift of power from parents to local authorities. So local authorities gain power to do things like to decide whether the child's best interests will be met by attending school or not, whereas previously that's been a parental decision, and parents have had to show that they're providing a suitable education. But this would be about the local authority deciding what's in the best interests of the child. Home educators don't like either of those proposals, but they feel particularly about this, that local authorities aren't really qualified to make those kind of decisions about children. That local authority staff are a whole range of different people, but they're generally not necessarily experienced in home education at all. They're making quite big decisions about people's lives. And there's also a lot of extra burden of data production by home educating parents and by education providers who see home educating children, all of which kind of betrays a total lack of understanding of how home education works, because basically they want the detail. They're putting they're putting a burden on providers of education to home educated children to provide their names and addresses and the names and addresses of the children to the local authority. So effectively what that means is if there's a home educated child in a class with non-home educated children, it seems like that will mean that whoever it is, it might be a gym or a climbing lesson or whatever, has to send details about home educated child. So there's a lot of extra data collection without really any clear indication of how that's actually going to improve anything for anybody. It's being done on the back, really, I think, of the Sarah Sharif case, which was an absolutely tragic, an awful case, but was a case where Sarah Sharif had actually been at school for the majority of her life, was very well known to authorities, had social workers involved, and it's the bill is kind of being written. The way that home educators are reading it is it's being written in a way which assumes that parents are a risk to their children and that this needs to be safeguarded at every level. And it's using cases like Sarah Sharif to argue we need more information on these children, but actually with someone like Sarah Sharif that would have made no difference because they knew about her. There was a failure to protect her, and she was ultimately killed by her father and stepmother, I think. And the other part that home educators are consistently frustrated about is that the one thing that really would help home educating families and really would support the education of children who are outside school would be funded exams, because currently home educating families have to pay for their child to do any GCSEs in exam centres. That generally costs about £400 per child per subject. Plus, there aren't many exam centres, so families will often have to do things like travel across the country and stay in a Premier Inn somewhere so that their child can take the exams. For many families, that's just an insurmountable burden. Their children just literally can't take GCSEs because they can't afford for them to take the exams. And yet, that's the kind of thing which genuinely would support families and genuinely would support children to be able to access further education. But that never comes into these bills. So, yes, I'm sure there's other stuff involved, but yes, there's basically been a high level of concern from home educators that power is being taken away from them and that there's no right of appeal. That's the other thing, that if a local authority brings a school attendance order on a particular child, they say we don't think this child's best interests are being met at school, we're going to give you a school attendance order which effectively says you are now forced to attend this school. There's no one to appeal to. There's no court. The only appeal is the Secretary of State. They have to write directly to the Secretary of State to say, we don't think this school attendance order is fair. And the Secretary of State has never overturned a school attendance order. So it's effectively a kind of absolute power on the part of local authorities to say, we think this child should be at school, with no comeback for parents, no appeal. And given that a large proportion of home educated children are actually children who've come out of school because it has gone wrong for them, it puts these families whose children have already had a really difficult experience of education, it puts them in a vulnerable position again.
And could be re-traumatizing the child in the way that you were describing earlier, that the role of the psychologist is to get the kid into school on the unquestioned assumption that being in school
is the right place,
is the best place for the child.
And when you think about it, it just makes no sense to think that you might have children who don't want to attend the school, parents who don't want them to attend the school, a school who doesn't necessarily want this child, and everybody is forced to do so by this school attendance order. It doesn't really, how anybody could think that's going to be a good educational outcome, I can't really see.
Yeah. I think, like you say, it's often very heightened, like because of instances of where child protection has failed and safeguarding has failed, and there's obviously like there's a sort of twin thing there. One is obviously like the very noble desire to ensure that every child is safe, right? But there's also a bit of an arse covering aspect to this, isn't there? Which is that like heads roll and people, there's always like somebody to blame when something goes wrong of that nature. And so I think that lots of the policies that are put into place, that are really quite onerous and bureaucratic, like you're talking about, collecting all of this data that everybody's going to be suddenly starting to do now, which nobody really can see how that's going to make children any safer, particularly. And yeah, you can see that it's sort of coming from a good place, but equally it's not. It doesn't feel particularly well thought through. And on the homeschooling thing, one thing that I have come to understand a bit about homeschooling is that it's so diverse and it's such a process as well. I think it might have been yourself, Naomi, when we spoke about this on a previous podcast. I'm not sure, but somebody anyway was sort of talking about how like often parents sort of day one of homeschooling, they're like, right, we'll get up at 9 o'clock and
that'll be me. Yeah,
we're going to do geography till 10.
Yeah,
and then we'll have some.
They set up their school corner. They have a desk,
Right.
and they have the curriculum. Yeah,
Yeah,
and then day 3, the child's like, no, that's it. Yeah,
right. So it often doesn't look, and also the process of deschooling, right, which we've spoken about before. Could you just sort of explain a little bit about what deschooling is? Because I think that's an important factor here, which may be absent from the thinking here.
Yeah, so basically when a child comes out of school, you need to go, both child and parent needs to go through a process of, well, kind of recovering from school. Actually, often if that child's had a bad time at school, it will take quite a long time for them to recover. But also they need to find a new way of learning, because we mostly think that school equals learning, but actually the research into home education shows that children learn really differently outside school. A lot more of it is informal, a lot more of it is self-led. Essentially because the power dynamic between children and adults outside school is completely different to the one inside school. You don't have all the factors which keep children behaving in the way that they do in school at home. For a start, if the child's bored, they can just stand up and walk off, and they do. Or if you're explaining something to them and they're not getting it, you can't just carry on in the way you might be able to do in a class of 30 children. You know that child's not getting it. So it's much more collaborative. Home education is always much more of a collaborative process, even if the parents are quite structured. And that takes a while to find. It doesn't just, you can't stop school on Friday, start home education on Monday, and it's like it'll always be. It takes, often parents and children will say it takes a good year or so of kind of recalibrating how they're going to learn, how this is going to work. And so when local authorities come in right quick on week 1, week 2 and say, where's your timetable? What are you doing? Families just don't know at that stage. They're just working out, how is this all going to work? And it takes a long time. And it takes a long time to sort of get out of that schooled mindset where you're expecting there to be a teacher, you're expecting there to be a curriculum.
Interesting to go back to a conversation that we were having with Warwick. And Warwick was talking about a particular area that he was involved in, where youngsters in an academy trust weren't getting any ICT. Was the example that he gave and talked about. And as a director of children's service, I've dealt with home educators, and home educators, lots of children in one of the areas where I worked were home educated because their parents were brethren. They were a particular sect of brethren. And one of the reasons why they home educated them was that the children weren't allowed to engage with computers, they weren't allowed to engage with television, they weren't allowed to engage with any form of modern technology. So they were taken out of school, partly to ensure that they remained brethren, but also to ensure that they weren't exposed to these elements. And there's a really interesting tension around this, because, up to a point, one feels one has to respect the view of parents. That's the religion that they've committed to. These are the impacts of that. But I could be challenging, in a sense, I could be challenging schools for a failure to provide a full and rich curriculum. But unless I have some form of engagement with home educators, then I don't have the ability to even begin the discussion with them around that. And I guess maybe that's the element that I'm looking for, that I don't think it should have been my responsibility as a local authority official, bureaucrat, grey-suited, dull person, to go around and say, do this. But I should have had the responsibility, I think, to be able to say, do you think, or tell me more, or whatever. And it is really difficult to find a landing space, I think, And it's like many other debates. Warwick was really good earlier on, I think, and well, been really good throughout. But he had a particular highlight around this failure to really engage in a discussion which involves listening in lots of areas of education. And I think we're in danger of getting into that around home education as well.
Yes, I think there's often a failure to talk to home educators about home education. There's a general assumption I have found, I've come across again and again there's a general assumption that teachers and schools know best about education and that they can impose this on home educators and essentially measure whether a home education program is good or not by how closely it resembles school. And I think this bill doesn't seem to me at all that it has been written in consultation with home educators. You can read it and you're like, this person doesn't really, whoever wrote this bill doesn't really understand how home education works. And unfortunately, just as you've been saying, David, it damages the relationship between parents and local authorities. And that's a really important relationship that you actually want to be a positive one, because that is where the influence might be. That is where someone might be able to say, oh, there are groups that your children could be going to and they could be interacting with other children. There are things out there that they could be accessing. And that's, I think, really where the ideal role of a local authority would be, if they were able to say, there are these opportunities available for your child, not in the sense you must do this or else we'll be taking you to court, but in the sense of, have you thought about this? Because that would lead for the best out. If you're thinking really about best outcomes for these children, then that's what you need to be thinking about: opportunities, relationships, expanding the world for them. And unfortunately, that isn't what they're looking at here. It just seems to be about, let's collect more data.
Yeah, interesting. So there's one more thing that I'd like to ask you about before you leave, and I have a hard out at the end of the hour. But I'd just like to ask Warwick, do you have any comments on this side of the schools bill?
I mean,
the stuff that we've been talking about.
I suppose it's it's interesting. I don't think that there's a few things. I suppose I don't think the parent voice is perhaps. Parents' point of view doesn't always feature very highly in education debates. I mean, not just within the education media, but I think in the media more generally. Obviously, teachers have unions that speak for them. Now we have Academy Trusts that have people speaking for them, but you can't. You would think the parent voice would be very powerful, but actually, there's no, often you'll read stories and it isn't really reflected at all. So I think that sort of, I think again, that's a shame, because, and we sort of forget that schools are supposed to be operating in loco parentis. They're sort of doing the parenting for the children while they're in school. And I just think there's a danger that, the parents and the education system should be working together, but often they seem to be sort of being pushed apart, and so that is a shame. And I've lost my next point. I was going to make another point about no, gone out of my head. Sorry.
Don't worry.
It's fascinating though. Sorry, if I may, it's really fascinating though, isn't it? Because one of the absolute principles that people are obsessed with is parental choice.
Yeah.
And we, clearly to challenge parental choice, which undermines community-based education, because people make the choice not to send their children to the local school. They send them elsewhere. And that's rigorously defended. But whether or not parental rights, post-parental choice, are defended to any extent becomes much, much more questionable. And I think there's something really, really interesting about that. And constantly people would defend exam results, for example. That's what parents want. That's what parents want for their children. It's a really, really interesting dynamic around that. And then you need to ask questions as to whether the National Governors Association, the NGA, are they a voice for parents? Should they be a voice for parents? It's a really interesting, complex question that we might think about a future podcast on, James.
Yes.
I have remember what I was going to say, actually. It's just that I guess To be honest, I haven't written that much about home education recently, but I am certainly sympathetic to home educators, because I think some of them, certainly the cases that come my way where parents have felt sort of powerless, and they felt very concerned about what was going on in some schools in relation to their child, and yet they've sort of felt powerless about what can be done about it. And they do end up at home educating, and again, I think it sort of ties into this sense that schools' decision making has been sort of taken away from communities, and therefore, that sometimes that's the approach they have to go down. But it's not an easy route at all. So. I can really feel for people who are concerned about that. They want some freedom to kind of say, look, I don't think this system is working for my child. I need to take them outside of it. And then they are, then it's also difficult for them potentially through what's being done with this bill. So although the bill is obviously coming from the right place, as you say, James, in terms of wanting to, children's welfare is certainly one consideration behind it, or the driving consideration for that. So sorry, I'm waffling a bit there, but it certainly does tie up to my world, definitely.
Waffling with elegance. I think that's important.
Thank you.
I think you've hit on something really important there, which is that lots of families feel pushed to this point of home educating because they feel their child's been let down by the system. And then to be then met with mistrust, you've got to, it just feels like another kick in the teeth, really.
Yeah.
And the thing is that actually these are families and children that we really need to be building relationships with. We want them to feel valued because they are doing an amazing job in many cases, and they're doing it often in non-ideal circumstances, and perhaps they wouldn't have chosen to do that. Most of them would like to have their children in school, and it's gone wrong. But then it's like this bill kind of undermines their ability to do what they can do, because, for example, one of the fears is if all education providers for home educated children are asked to have to send everything into the local authority, some may just say, I'm not doing it. We won't provide this service to home educated children. We can only provide it to school children because we don't have this extra administrative burden. A lot of these places will just be doing an hour and a half class with kids, and to then expect that they must collect data on all the kids and send that off everywhere. It's just one of these things that puts a burden onto people that they may not be able to meet.
Right.
Yeah.
Sorry, were you going to come in there, Warwick?
I'm just coming back to the school choice idea as well. I mean, that is the theory behind education reform in the last few decades, that parents don't like something, they've got the ability to go to another school. But in reality, there isn't really much choice out there, in the sense that, if people want very, very alternative approaches to education, I'm sure has been discussed on a podcast of radically different approaches. It's very difficult to see how that. I mean, you could think of one or two schools around the country really going down those kind of routes, but generally it's quite difficult. When you've got Ofsted, which is kind of looking quite narrowly at what goes on in schools, it's the reality is it's not easy to find sort of a very different approach, and therefore, so the notion of choice, although it can kind of be used to kind of shut down that parental perspective, because it's you just go somewhere else, then actually there isn't often a meaningful choice. So it doesn't really work, I don't think.
Yeah.
They're only interested in choice on the basis of performance, not the nature of delivery.
Yeah.
And it's all part of the marketization of the system. You go to the place that gives you the best results, best deal. And you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
If that institution is busy kicking out some kids so it gets the better results, is that the better institution,
Totally.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And the irony that a bill that's called the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill is causing such anxiety and stress and negatively impacting the well-being of hundreds of thousands of families and young people in the whole homeschooling sector. It's not lost on me.
Up a bit there for me.
What's that?
You've just broken up a little bit for me. I don't know if it was the same for the others.
Oh, right. I was just talking about the irony of the Children's Wellbeing in Schools Bill. It looks like it's actually negatively impacting the well-being of lots of people in the homeschooling sector. So if I may, I'd like to wrap up in the last 5 minutes or so by asking you both a question. When I asked you both to come together, it sort of came together just out of conversations between myself and David, because you were both naturally sort of the go-to people thinking about different aspects of this schools bill on the academy side and on the homeschooling side. But there's also something else that you share in common, which and I would also put myself in this category, which is that we are in different ways quite outspoken about problems that we see in the school system. I wrote a blog. I was just discussing with David before you both came on. I wrote a blog at the weekend called "Confronting the Educational Polycrisis." That people often talk about the polycrisis as this sort of global phenomenon, climate change and war and economics and so on. But also, I think within education, there is a polycrisis with attendance and behavior and teacher recruitment and retention and misogyny and inequality and all kinds of very complex, tangled, very serious endemic situations going on. And naturally, these things need to be critiqued. But one thing that I've noticed is that when people do this, they're very quickly described as school shamers, and it's like there's this label that is pinned, and I've seen that label applied to both of you online over the last months and years, and to myself when I've become more strident in my criticisms of what's going on. And people sort of say, like, it's just really unhelpful. People are working so hard. Teachers are really, put upon, and we're all trying to make the best of a difficult situation. And it's really unhelpful to have these sort of criticisms leveled. I just wanted to ask you both about your reflections on this. Like, what would be your response to this accusation of school shaming? I wonder, I might ask yourself first on that, Naomi, and then we'll go to Warwick.
Yes, school shaming and teacher beating.
Right, or bashing, teacher bashing.
Yeah, teacher bashing, exactly. Yes. And I think it's a misunderstanding because it's tricky, isn't it? Because people are devoting their lives to running schools, to running institutions. They are working very hard. They are putting enormous amounts of effort in it. They are burning out. And part of that is what I'm trying to say, which is actually we've got a system which isn't, we can work really, really hard on it, but it isn't working. And it's a bit like, I suppose it's a bit like the analogy is my work as a psychologist. If I've got this stream of children coming who are really anxious, who've got all sorts of mental health problems, I can work really hard treating them all. I can put them all through the best evidence-based practice, and I can do my absolute best, and I can burn myself out in the process. And the children still keep coming because actually the problem isn't that I'm not working hard enough. The problem isn't that the problem is that the system is creating this distress in children. And that's what I'm always trying to say. We've got a system here which isn't working for children and for young people. And it's really hard when you're part of that system to reflect on that because you're complicit in it. And I find it hard when I'm thinking about mental health and there are many things we could talk about mental health and the mental health sort of marketization of that and all the kind of things which I have, the reservations I have about that. But I think that the benefit of being from the outside, and that's another accusation that's often leveled against me. You haven't got a clue, you're not a teacher, you're not doing the work. I think we have to be able to look at things from the outside. We have to be able to look at the institutions and critique them and say, is this system working in the way it's going to work? Because otherwise we just all continue, don't we? We all just work very, very hard. We all burn ourselves out and nothing ever changes. And I think we need better for our children than that.
Thank you for that. What would be your response, Warwick?
I actually, you were breaking up there. I didn't get the question. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. It was the question that I flagged with you earlier about the accusation of school shaming that is sometimes leveled at people who critique the system, or teacher bashing was the other one that Naomi just raised there.
Yeah, teacher bashing is an interesting one because often it is teachers coming to me to raise concerns about things that are going on the ground. I'd say probably more than parents, actually. But I mean, school shaming, I mean, so coming back to, I set up my website because so many concerns were being raised about what was going on in schools, particularly in the academy system as a whole. And I think people come to me because there's a sense that schools have been made more remote from their communities. Parents or indeed teachers. I'm thinking of this example of parents that they feel that they've tried to raise issues within the school and they're concerned about what's happening in some cases with respect to their children, and they don't feel that the system gives them any real way of expressing that official challenge that are possibly going to lead to change. So they come to the media, and they do come to people like me, and you know, and they want to see this, you know, concerns aired in public. And I think you know, people talking about school shaming would rather those stories didn't come out at all, and you know, there wasn't, or if there was any reporting, that you'd have to anonymize everything, so you couldn't be, it wasn't clear who was actually taking decisions. And you know, I don't think I try and personalize things in terms of the decision making, but I do think that, you know, there should be some, you know, answerability to local communities when decisions are taken. I think, and I think, you know, if we talk about any kind of institutional reporting is in terms of shaming, then and therefore shouldn't be allowed, essentially, is what you're saying, then you're kind of shutting down virtually all journalism. I mean, any kind of expose that you can think of that's held individuals to account publicly would not be, you know, would not be permissible. I mean, we talk about shaming the post office. We can't do that in terms of what it did. You know, I could go through endless investigative stories. I mean, you know, essentially you are shutting down journalism through that. And you know, the users of services are entitled to their point of view. And it's really interesting what Naomi was saying about being criticised, certainly seeing her criticised, and I've been criticised along the lines of, well, you're not teaching, you don't have an experience. But, you know, the people on the end of those practices, you know, surely should have a voice. You know, pupils are ultimately the ones on the end of this. They've not taught, but they, you know, they certainly know how they feel about some of the effects of this, and some of them will carry that through their lives. So of course we, you know, it's like, of course we should, you know, these issues should be out there and debated and covered.
Yeah, completely.
I think,
go on,
Jay, just for a second, I think one other thing that I think you, I and Warwick all share is I think we've all got teenage children as well.
Yeah,
haven't we?
Right.
So
Yeah,
we've got
absolutely.
the other end of that as well.
Yeah, as parents, of course. And yeah, that's it. I mean, it always strikes me as a very weak attempt to sort of to police the public debate, to say, like, you don't get to have a say because you're not a teacher, and also you don't get to criticize anybody because, you know, that's really difficult for us to hear. We're in the thick of it, working every day.
Yeah, I mean,
and you can understand those feelings, right?
Yeah.
You don't want to feel like, you use the word complicit there, Naomi, and that's such a loaded word. Like, nobody wants to feel like they are complicit in a system that you know, makes
doing
kids
harm.
feel bad, right? And teachers, this is the fault of teachers. The start of this of that piece that I wrote about the educational polycrisis. Like, there's 85 million or so teachers on planet Earth, and they every day, every weekday, they go out and do really, really hard work, and you know, against the odds, and try to make it work despite everything. But these pressures are not caused by teachers. They're things that have grown and evolved around us. They're often implemented with the best will in the world, with the best of intentions, as we've been discussing, and they have these nefarious side effects, which we need to have searching, robust conversations about. And so I'm glad that you don't let these wild accusations of teacher bashing stop you from raising the important issues that you both do. I'm very grateful for your contribution to this podcast, and also to the debate generally. I think you both do amazing work, and I'm very grateful for it.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you.
And that feels like a wrap. So unless there's anything that anybody would like to add. Nope. Okay. then we'll leave it there. Thank you both very much.
Yeah,
really,
so much.
really interesting.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that.
No.
Thank you.